What up, Wizards? It's Dev and the Chicken here with some spoilers for the Cowboys set. We had a few over the weekend. They've been doing like 45, 50 a day all week, but it really slowed to a trickle over the last couple of days. We only got to see 8 cards, but it was definitely a case of quality over quantity. There's only a couple of cards to speed through today. Most of what we're going to talk about is all cards I think there might be viable stuff to do with. So let's go ahead and get to it. But I guess there's got to be a worse card of the weekend. So let's start with Gem Lightfoot Sky Explorer. This is 4 mana, 2 a white and a blue for a 3/3 legendary human scout with flying and vigilance. At the beginning of your end step, if you haven't cast a spell from your hand this turn, draw a card. So this is truly outrageous with like plot effects and limited, but it doesn't go too much farther than that. I guess you could make a case to put this in your control deck and then you get to draw a card every turn. Hey, but like I still don't think it's going to be very good there either, to be honest. But hey, at least I got to make that gem reference, and whenever you play it, you get to sing your favorite gem song. Mine's Glitter and Gold. Let's move on to Metamorphic Blast. This is a single blue mana for an instant with Spree. You can pay an extra 1. Until end of turn, target creature becomes a white rabbit with base power and toughness 0/1. You can also pay 3 to have target player draw 2 cards. This might not look like much, but I actually think it's a nice little take on the old 4 mana instant speed draw 2 they tend to print in just about every set nowadays. First of all, cool wrinkle here is that you can target any player with the draw mode, which I think is kind of neat, just in case you want to mill them out and they're really low. Or maybe you've got a Shieldred in play, you want them to lose some life. And hey, if they've got a Shieldred in play, you can do all these things at the same time, turn off their Shieldred and go ahead and draw your cards. That's a fun line. If you've got a Wandering Emperor token, it can basically block anything now, and you shoot the thing down with this, your Wandering Emperor token takes care of the rest. Same thing with like Restless Anchorage and even Might tokens. You know, if you go in with a Might token from Mirex and they block it, you can now kill just about anything, barring anything with +1/+1 counters with your Might token. So if this card gets big in standard, basically every Might token goes unblocked till the end of time, so long as your control opponent has cards in hand, because they might blow you out with this. So I don't know. Again, there's some cool applications for it, but I'm still not sure it goes anywhere. I don't think it's going to take the place of Memory Deluge anytime soon, right? But I did want to spend a little time on it. It's not too often that you see like removal stapled to card draw, and you can do both at the same time. Doesn't even have to be like a removal spell that you use to, you know, blow out blocks or anything like that. You can just kind of fog a creature for a turn. Sometimes that'll buy you a turn and be good enough too. So I don't know. Altogether, I like the total package here. Just a couple more uncommons, but most of the uncommons today were really cool. Like we got to see Sandstorm Verge too. This is a land. It's a desert, and it taps for a colorless mana. You can also pay 3 and tap it, and suddenly target creature can't block this turn. You can only activate this as a sorcery, which is kind of fine. I don't love that sorcery speed, and honestly, I don't know that this is going to take the place of like Mishra's Foundry in any aggro decks anytime soon or anything like that, but I do think that it's a pretty cool little ability to have access to in a deck that's trying to attack, especially in a format where you're either up against aggro or you're up against a deck where your opponent has 1 creature at all times. It seems like there's a lot of, you know, mid-range and control decks in the format that actually don't have that many creatures available to them at any given time. So something like this could actually help you get in pretty well on attacks, or just stop their like Glissa, you know, their first striking Death Toucher from being able to block your dudes. Like all of that seems pretty decent, and it does cost basically a total of 4 mana to do the ability, so it's really only going to happen in the late game. But I do think there's some aggro decks that might be interested in this kind of thing. But that said, we might have to wait until other things aren't in the format anymore, but by the time those other things aren't in the format anymore, I'm pretty sure this won't be either, so it might be a moot point. Last thing though, I will say, just in standard, because I gotta bring up a couple of standard lines that are stupid and will probably never happen ever, but with things like Unstable Glyph Bridge and the Eternal Wanderer, right? Like those are both effects that'll leave 1 creature on your opponent's side of the table, so I guess you can get in unblocked. It's also kind of worth noting that this doesn't sacrifice to do this. You can do this forever, every turn, so long as you got the mana to do it. So I think that's a nice little upside too. Just altogether, it's a cool little desert. You know, it doesn't come into play untapped, and I always kind of value that a little bit in these like special land types. So I don't know, cool card altogether. Not sure it's going to make too much of a splash, but I do like it. Let's move on to the last uncommon of the day, and this one could have been a rare, you know, like everyone's talking about this, and for good reason. Let's look at Return the Favor. 2 red mana for an instant with Spree. +1 mana, copy target instant spell, sorcery spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. That's a lot of different things to copy. You may choose new targets for the copy, of course. And for another +1, you can change the target of target spell or ability, or with a single target. This card's busted. Like, there's so many cool things about it. It's a fork and also kind of a misdirect effect. It's just exactly those two cards. But it's also kind of a wild ricochet. It's like 50 different cards that have been printed in Magic history, but they're all kind of stapled together on this one card for a little extra mana, and I'm totally fine with that. I also like that the dude in the artwork appears to be casting fork. It's a good reference. I get your references. But apart from cool references, the card itself is actually a little bit busted. Like, I don't know how great it actually is in practice, but there's so much this can actually do. Just starting with limited, this is kind of a ridiculous card there, because if your opponent tries to remove one of your things with a instant or sorcery, then suddenly you get to remove 2 of their guys if you pay 4 total mana for this. But even if you only have the mana to like misdirect their spell to one of their own dudes, you're still kind of blowing them out. So I would actually play a few copies of this in limited if I was able to get it, and it's just an uncommon. Probably the thing that's gotten the most press is that this is a red counterspell against counterspells. This actually counters counterspells in 2 different ways. Both modes do it in their own way, which I think is really fun, right? You could always copy the counterspell and use it to counter the counterspell that's on the stack, or you could use the second mode to redirect the counterspell to counter return the favor. Right? And so return the favor will resolve first. Counterspell has nothing to counter when it gets to its point on the stack, kind of fizzles. So yeah, this just counters all the counterspells. So I think that's kind of fun. Also might have plenty of fun stuff to do in standard. Yet another thing that copies spells in the Teamer World Souls Rage deck, but it can also counter the counterspells that they're trying to counter your World Souls Rage with. So I don't know, it has a couple of applications there. And in the early game, it can double up a removal spell, or again, misdirect a removal spell away from your Nissa or whatever you're trying to do. So there's a lot of applications for it in that one deck, and maybe even some others. A card like this is kind of hard to get working some of the time, but once you do, and you're in the right format to get it to work, suddenly it can just pop off, you know? Like, I'll copy or Breach the Multiverse. That's a thing people are doing. Oh, I'll copy your Herd Migration. That's a thing people are doing. So I don't know. There's a lot of cool stuff about this. You can even just like copy their Sunfall, and yeah, that's 2 Sunfalls, but yours resolves first, and so you get the incubator token. There's a lot of little stuff about this card that I like. Well, let's move into the rares for today and take a look at Wily Duke. That's the name of the card. Wily Duke, a Tian hero. This is 3 mana, 1 a green and a white for a 4/2 legendary human ranger with vigilance. But here comes the puzzle. Whenever Wily Duke, a Tian hero, becomes tapped, you gain 1 life and draw a card. How am I going to tap it if it's got vigilance? That's so it does not read whenever this card attacks, gain a life, draw a card, which if it did, it would still just kind of be fine, to be honest. The 2 toughness really dampens the spirits on this one. But at the same time, there's a lot of ways you can tap this down in standard. There's obviously saddle. At least it should have been obvious. Not only is a set mechanic, but they're riding a horse. So they're trying to spell it out for you here. So it's like saddle it up. You could also crew a vehicle, right? Or you could convoke something, you know, use this to get your Knight Errant of Eos out or something like that. And suddenly you gain in life, you're drawing cards. Feeling good, especially if you do convoke a Knight Errant out, because you kind of draw 3 off of that play. Get a 4/4, gain a life, feel good, like you're actually doing something, you know? That's seems like a pretty good little play line. But there's dumb stuff. I should tell you about the dumb stuff that you're never going to actually do, but I should at least bring it up because it's cool, right? I've been looking for something to do with Scene of the Crime since that card came out. And hey, we got a creature to tap down for Scene of the Crime. Get a little mana, some cards, some life, sure. There's also Takasia. You'll never do this, but I guess you could... You can tap this to Takasia and Surveil, whatever, have a good time. But probably the most powerful of these, which isn't really a high bar for the last couple of cards. But one that you might actually do one day is Relic of Legends, right? You can tap this down for mana, gain a life, draw a card, have a party. So, you know, all that's actually pretty sweet. There's a lot of ways to tap this down in standard, and some of them are even halfway powerful. But let's keep moving and look at Akul, the Unrepentant. This is 2 black and 2 red, 4 mana for a 5/5 legendary Scorpion Dragon Rogue with Flample. Nice stats for the mana cost, dude. You can also sacrifice 3 other creatures to put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. But you can only do this once per turn and as a sorcery. Yikes. So like you're looking for the downside here. Now it's just a 4 mana 5/5 Flample. We just kind of get those nowadays. No big deal, right? But also, I kind of think the sack 3 creatures mode on this is legitimately busted. I'm slightly worried. I know some people are like, sack 3 creatures who really cares? And you got to have a guy in your hand. Like, yeah, it's easy. Pretty sure it's easy enough to have a relatively big creature in your hand to slap down with this. And I know you're coming down on board presence to play one guy, so it's really got to be worth it. But again, I really don't think that situation is too hard to engineer, you know. First of all, there's a lot of ways to make a bunch of little tokens all at one time. You know, Gleeful Demolition is a pretty good way, and you've got like Voldaren Epicure and Bloodtithe Harvester in this guy's colors to make sure you can even get artifacts in the first place. So that seems like a slam dunk right there. But there's also like mercenaries in this set. You know, there's like a bunch of creatures that, even at some of them at a good rate, that put like an extra dude into play. So that's like 2/3 of the way to the number of creatures you need to sack this dude. You know, if you want to add white to your deck, there's Resolute Reinforcements as well. Wedding Announcement, again, if you want to add white, adds all of the creatures to the board that are needed to sack to this. So I don't know, if you want to throw down an Atali in these colors, that's a good one to throw down. But, you know, just a Traxa or something like that. It shouldn't be too hard to make it work. And in the meantime, you've got this ridiculous bridge card, right? Because in the early game, you're trying to fill the board with creatures. In the late game, you're trying to get that Atraxa if you get the mana out. But this is, again, the best bridge imaginable. A 5/5 Flample. If you do sack those guys, you still got a 5/5 Flample, and whatever you put down, you should be okay, you know? So I actually think this might be ludicrous. And if they do have the removal for the 5/5 Flying Trample guy, they still have to have the removal for the thing you put down, because you can use the activated ability on this before they're actually able to remove it. So you're like guaranteed to get value if you have creatures to sack and a guy in your hand. Also, one last thing, Agatha's Soul Cauldron. This is an activated ability right here. So like, if this is available on all your dudes, you might be able to do something broken with it. So I don't know. I got a lot to say about this guy. I actually think, though, just like on a baseline level, 4 mana 5/5 Flying Trample with no real downsides is almost good enough. And you don't have to use this ability, but if you ever find yourself in a position where like, oh, I can get rid of these tokens and play an Atali, like, you'll just do that, right? Shouldn't have to tell you that. So I don't know. The dude looks kind of amazing, and there's already a Rakdos mid-range deck in Standard. It doesn't play all the creatures in the world, so I'm not sure it's going to try to leverage this, but we may see a build that does. Like, sure, I'll sack 3 dudes to throw down my Trumpeting Carnosaur. Like, again, it sounds like a party, dude. Sounds like a great time, but let's move on. Because there are somehow cards people are talking about more than that. Here's Annie Joins Up next. This is 4 mana, 1 a red, a green, and a white for a legendary enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls. All right, okay. If a triggered ability of a legendary creature you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. It's this thing from Maro's teaser. Just one. Everybody gets a Panharmonicon in every single set. Are you sick of them yet? I know you really liked them last year. I went through like every legendary creature in Standard, and there's like 1,500 that this actually helps, you know? So I'm not going to give myself that much editing to do. I'm just going to stick with the colors that this card is and the most powerful things that you can do. First of all, there's Voha. This comes down a turn before Voha, and you have to skip a turn playing creatures, which you don't want to do in your Voha deck, but you get rewarded by triggering Voha twice. And what's more than that, and maybe even more important in some cases, is that it effectively is going to give Voha Ward 6. It does work that way, so they just basically just cannot kill your Voha the turn she comes down, which is a massive deal in and of itself. So just in Voha, that's good enough, I think. But there's also Rocco, the one from Aftermath. Making him trigger twice actually seems like a pretty ridiculous thing to do, but there's probably more powerful stuff. There's things like Aurelia that can come down the turn after Annie joins up. But again, you don't love skipping your turn 4. You want to be playing creatures in your Aurelia deck, but doubling up these triggers is really tempting. There's Jeru and Hazaret. That seems busted if you can actually get it to work, and it should come down the turn after Annie joins up too. An Impakal, that's okay at the very least. You know, double triggers on that is good. You've got Breaches to get like double treasure tokens, I guess, if that's what you want. Seems good. Jenny Faye is in the mix here to get extra tokens. Kadama of the West Tree, that's a legend. That'll give you extra ramp. You've got Lorna of the Third Path to blow up everything. Nissa to get tons and tons of mana value, right? And then finally, my favorite one, Anzrag. You just triggering Anzrag twice seems like a fun time too. But there's so much you can do with this, and I didn't even like nail all of the cards in this color combination that do stuff with this card. There's a bunch more, so let me know what your favorite ones are in the comments section. There's a lot to do with this. Again, just in Standard if you want to try something fun and janky. Not sure it quite gets there, but Especially when you get to the realm of Commander, you start just really coming up with some busted garbage you can do with this card. And I've seen a lot of people not actually very excited about it because they think the busted garbage will be too much, especially the people who are commenting that you put it in Voha. They seem downright upset about what this card can do. So, but pretty good Magic card. Costs 4 whole mana, and that might price it out of competitive playability, but I do think this has a chance. But our final card of the weekend and our final green mythic of the set, at least it better be. I'm pretty sure this is like the 10th mythic with green in it that we've seen in this set. They're really trying to rehab green, and cards like Gold Vin Hydra, they might get there, man. This is X and a green for a Hydra with Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. Now, it's a 0/0, but it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, and when it dies, you get a number of tapped treasure tokens equal to its power. Again, it's just no big deal. It's like a Shivan Devastator that pays you back most of the mana that you spent to cast it, which is pretty good. It has extra abilities. Like, flying is a pretty relevant ability on Devastator, but Vigilance, Trample, and Haste, yeah, so I guess they both have Haste, but like Vigilance and Trample, pretty important. One's important in a Wandering Emperor format, right? And then Trample's just not the same as Flying, but it's an evasive ability, and once this thing gets big enough, it's basically just going to steamroll anything that tries to get in its way. So Trample's going to be incredibly important, especially when you rip it off the top of your library and your ramp deck on turn 7 or whatever it is. So that's good, but it might actually be kind of halfway decent to play on turn 3 as just like a 2/2. Because then you get a couple of treasures when it dies, and that's like actual viable ramp, again, to help bridge that gap. If you play this on turn 4, is that technically better than Invasion of Zendikar if you're just planning to cast your Atraxa once anyway? Like, I'm going to play this 3/3 on turn 4. Vigilance, Trample, Haste. Doesn't actually seem that much in the context of modern Magic, but now if you kill it, if you strike me down, I Ben Kenobi you. I will become more powerful. You could possibly imagine. Give me those treasure tokens right now is all I'm saying. But I guess if you play this on turn 4 for X = 3 and they kill it, you played a worse at Sushi. But at least that Sushi sees like some play in Standard right now. Not much. Not really any. But I like to believe. Sometimes it's in Rakdos mid-range or whatever. But still. I think this card has a lot of applications. It reminds me not only of Shivan Devastator, but also a little bit, don't look at me sideways here, of Hydroid Krasis. Because that card, the scaling was the important thing, right? Shivan Devastator, there's not really like a mono red mid-range deck. There's not really like a red X mid-range deck that really wants a card like that. I guess you could say, again, Rakdos mid-range is a thing, but again, doesn't really want a card like that. It wants to set up later game plays and reanimation and stuff like that, discover plays and whatever. It doesn't really have room for Devastator. I think there's a lot of green decks that'll have room for a card like this, just like they found room for Krasis, because Krasis was a decent stopgap measure in the early game. Draw a card, gain some life, block your guy, whatever. And then when I draw my second Krasis, it's huge and ridiculous, and it draws me 1,000,000 cards, right? And it draws me into another Krasis, which is another thing this kind of does. It doesn't draw you into another copy of itself, but if you happen to have another copy of it in your hand when it dies, then all the treasures the first one gives you are going to help you make the second one bigger, which I think is really cool too. So, if your opponent answers this with like go for the throat or a block to match it or whatever, then suddenly getting 3, 4, 5, 6 late in the game treasures is going to be this massive deal. So, sometimes they want to chump it. They chump it, they lose a guy, they take like 4 or 5. If they just kill it with the removal spell because they finally found the removal spell, well, you get all the ramp. You just get all of the ramp, all the mana you'll ever need for the rest of the game, and that seems sick. They can't kill it with Wandering Emperor. The only thing that actually exiles this reliably is going to be like Sunfall. So, and I will say the card does look a little bit worse in a Sunfall standard, but that said, you're probably going to be in your mid-range deck, you're like waiting, or your ramp deck, you're like waiting until after the Sunfall actually cast this card, right? So, altogether, here's Leyline Binding. I should point that card out too. So there's some exile in the format, right? But if you're up against Swamps, I think that's a pretty good card right here. But altogether, again, you really got to factor in the scalability. You got to factor in that a card like Shivan Devastator may not have seen too much play because it wants to be in these super aggressive decks, but they're just better options, This wants to be in kind of mid-rangey or rampy decks, hybrids of the two, really. And I think it serves a better function there than Shivan Devastator serves in the decks that want it, right? So completely different cards. The fact that they're being compared makes perfect sense. I compare cards that don't make sense to compare all the time, and people are like, why are you comparing these cards? So I am the last person who should be like, these are completely different cards. So they're not. Flying Haste. Well, haste and evasive ability, 1 and X, they're very similar cards. But that said, I do think that, again, this is just overall the better package, not just because of the treasure tokens, but because the decks that want it are going to be able to leverage it in a better way. But ladies and gentlemen, that is all Ski Kowalski for today. There's something like 40 cards left in the set, plus we got to cover the, big score bonus sheet or whatever that is, because those cards are going to be standard legal too, and those are all going to come rolling out soon. Plus commander cards after that. There's a lot of stuff to cover here in spoiler season, so don't leave the channel just yet. Subscribe if you're new. I think we still need like 10 subscribers or whatever it is to get to 132,000 subscribers. We're super, super close. Hit the button if you haven't done it yet. Like the video if you haven't done that yet. Helps me out a lot and feeds the algorithm monster. We all want to do that, right? And aside from that, just check out the Patreon if you really want to support the channel. $1 a month to pick what decks we do once Outlaws actually hits the streets. And honestly, there's already a lot of stuff in the chamber for this coming up like deck tech season. And I asked Twitter about this earlier today. They seem jacked about it. But last question of the day, in case you're still here. A lot of people sign off before this part, but I'm considering turning deck techs into these like hour-long deep dives with matchup guides and sideboard guides and like gameplay examples for nearly every card that we talk about and stuff like that. Gameplay examples for combo loops that we discuss, and just all this just huge long videos that are, rather than the 20-minute thing that we usually do. I want to go really deep on deck techs. So let me know how you feel about that idea in the comments section. I had a couple extra minutes today to discuss something like that with you, so I took it. Hope you don't mind. Aside from that, though, I'm not going to ask anything else of you. Just keep watching the channel, man. There's a lot more spoilers to cover, even if it seems like we're really close to the end. But I'll see you guys tomorrow afternoon. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.